1,500 soldiers, different units, different years, different shifts, the same building, the same shadow in the third-floor window, the same sound at 0300, boots on hardwood floors, slow and deliberate, moving down a corridor that has been sealed since 1991. I was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas for 3 years. I worked the night shift. I heard things I don't talk about at dinner tables. And I watched my chain of command do what chains of command always do when soldiers report the unexplainable. They wrote environmental anomaly in the incident log. They moved on. But here's what nobody tells you about Fort Riley. The post was built on ground that absorbed 150 years of violent American history. The Civil War, the Indian Wars, 2 world wars, hundreds of men who died on that soil, inside those buildings, in ways the official records don't describe. Some of them, apparently, never left. Fort Riley sits in the Flint Hills of north-central Kansas, about 90 miles west of Topeka. It was established in 1853 as a military outpost along the Santa Fe Trail. For over a century and a half, it has been one of the largest active military installations in the United States, currently home to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Most people know it as a training post, a historic post. What most people don't know is what lives inside Building 608. I'll get to that. My name is Marcus Cole. I served as a military police sergeant at Fort Riley from 2009 to 2012. My job on the surface was standard security, patrol the installation, respond to incidents, maintain order. Fort Riley is a small city, 27,000 acres, thousands of residents, hundreds of buildings ranging from modern barracks to structures that predate the Civil War. The older buildings were my problem, not because they were structurally unsafe. The Army maintains its property. No, the older buildings were a problem because of what soldiers reported inside them, and because of how those reports were handled. Let me give you some history first. In 1866, Fort Riley became the home of the famous 7th Cavalry under General George Custer. In 1867, a cholera outbreak swept through the post, killing hundreds of soldiers in a matter of weeks. The dead were buried in the post cemetery, Custer Hill Cemetery, which still exists today. The Civil War-era barracks that survived into the modern era were built with stone quarried from the local hills, thick walls, narrow windows, floors that flex and creak with temperature changes. When those buildings are quiet, they sound like they're breathing. I did my first night patrol through Building 608 in the spring of 2009. The building had been used as an administrative facility for most of the previous 2 decades and was in the process of being converted for other purposes. During the conversion period, it sat largely empty. My patrol partner that first night was Specialist Amanda Rice, a 22-year-old from rural Georgia who had been at Fort Riley for 8 months. She had done the building before. As we signed in at the exterior checkpoint, she said, very matter-of-factly, "Third floor is weird, just so you know." I asked what she meant. She didn't answer. I learned what she meant at approximately 2:47 in the morning on a clear Kansas night in April 2009, when I heard boots moving across the floor above me in a building that had been empty since 1700 hours the previous day. Slow, deliberate, moving from east to west. I looked at Rice. She looked at me. "Environmental anomaly," she said. She was joking, but the phrase would follow me for 3 years. The history of Building 608, as I came to understand it through my own research and through conversations with soldiers who had been at the post longer than I had, was not complicated. It was old. People had died in it. And for reasons that nobody had ever been able to document to the satisfaction of a military incident report. Soldiers who spent time in that building alone, particularly at night, particularly on the 3rd floor, reported things. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. Sergeant First Class Delroy Pittman, who had been at Fort Riley since the 1990s, told me over coffee in the summer of 2009 that in his 20 years on post, he had personally heard accounts from at least 30 separate soldiers about the 3rd floor of Building 608. Different unit assignments, different decades, all of them describing the same thing. Footsteps, slow, westbound, beginning at the east stairwell door and moving toward the west-facing windows. Always at night, always between 0200 and 0400. I wrote it off as legend, old post, old buildings, soldiers with too much imagination and too little sleep. I wrote it off until the night I saw it myself. The incident that changed everything for me happened on the 14th of November, 2010. I want to be precise about the date because I have thought about it almost every day since then, and I am not someone who misremembers things. It was a Thursday, 1400 hours overcast. I was assigned a solo patrol of the administrative building sector from 2200 to 0600. Rice was on compassionate leave. I was working alone. At 0217, I entered building 608. The ground and second floors were unremarkable. I completed my sweep methodically, noting nothing unusual. I signed the log at each checkpoint. At 0244, I reached the third floor landing. The corridor was dark. Emergency lighting at each end. 12 doors along one side, 8 along the other. The floor surface was original hardwood, covered in places by vinyl tile that had been laid sometime in the 1970s. The whole space smelled the way old military buildings smell. Cleaning solution, old paper, something mineral and cold underneath. I walked the corridor east to west. At approximately 0251, I reached the fourth door from the west end. Something made me stop. I don't know what. There was no sound. There was no movement. But I stopped, and I turned, and I looked back down the corridor toward the east. There was a figure at the far end. It stood in the emergency lighting at the east stairwell door, facing me. I want to be extremely precise here, because I know what I'm saying. It was the shape of a person, tall, narrow shoulders, standing completely still, in the posture of someone who is waiting. I reached for my radio. In the 3 seconds it took me to bring the radio to my mouth, I kept my eyes on the figure. I did not look away. I did not blink. And in those 3 seconds, it was gone. Not quickly. Not like someone running. It simply ceased to be there. Between one blink and the next, the corridor was empty. I cleared the building. I found nothing. No evidence of unauthorized entry, no disturbed locks, no footprints in the dust near the east stairwell. The exterior checkpoint showed no sign-ins after my own. I filed an incident report. I described exactly what I had seen. The report was categorized as possible unauthorized civilian entry, no evidence found. Case closed. 18 months later, in May of 2012, I was reviewing old incident logs as part of a routine administrative function. I was looking for a specific date, and I was scrolling quickly through the records. I stopped when I saw a report from August of 2005. Third floor, building 608. Possible unauthorized entry, no evidence found. The description of the figure at the east stairwell was identical to mine. I kept scrolling. November 2003. Same building, same floor, same figure. Same east stairwell. March 2001, September 1998. Going back to the oldest digital records from 1994, there were 14 separate incidents describing the same figure in the same location in the same building. 14 incidents in 18 years. The same figure. The same door. The same time window. Not a rumor. Not legend passed between bored soldiers over coffee. 14 separate official incident reports filed by 14 separate military police officers across 5 different unit rotations. I started talking to people. What I found over the following months was considerably larger than I had expected. The figures, because there was more than one as it turned out, had been reported not only in Building 608, but in 3 other structures on the post. The old cavalry stables, a stone building that had served various administrative functions since the 1870s, and a section of the original post hospital, portions of which still stood in a modified form. And the encounters were not limited to brief visual sightings. Soldiers reported sounds, not just footsteps. Voices, not words, but the murmur of conversation, audible through floors and walls in empty buildings. Temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees in specific locations, sudden and localized, that resolved as quickly as they appeared. One account, from a specialist in 2007, described hearing what she could only describe as a roll call being conducted in an empty room. A sergeant's voice methodically calling names, followed by silence where responses would have been. Private First Class James Wakefield, stationed at Fort Riley in 2004, told me in 2012 that he had witnessed two soldiers from his unit, independently on different nights, return from patrol assignments in the old administrative sector and independently request reassignment from the night rotation. Neither would say why. Both accepted official note of personal reasons in their records. Neither spoke about it again while they were on post. I eventually compiled a list. Not formally. This was personal research, conducted on my own time, recorded in a notebook I kept in my personal vehicle. Soldiers I had spoken to directly, incidents I had cross-referenced in official records, secondary accounts that could be verified against multiple sources. The number I arrived at by the time I left Fort Riley in 2012 was somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 individual soldiers who had, in some form, experienced or reported something anomalous in the older buildings of that post in the previous 30 years. Let that number settle for a moment. Not a unit campfire story, not a haunted building legend passed down through a single rotation. A consistent, multi-decade, multi-unit pattern of reported phenomena that had been individually documented, individually filed, and individually categorized as environmental anomaly or no evidence found, and never, in 30 years of recorded history, examined as a whole, because nobody had looked at all of it together, until I did. And what I found when I looked at it together wasn't chaos. It was a pattern. The same buildings, the same floors, the same time windows, the same categories of experience reported independently by people who had never met each other. A pattern is not a ghost story. A pattern is evidence. I want to tell you about the night of the 20th of February, 2012. I was 3 months from the end of my assignment at Fort Riley. I had been quietly documenting for almost 2 years by that point. I had said nothing to my chain of command about the scope of what I had found. I had learned from those 14 incident reports that official channels led nowhere. On that night, I was working with a 2-person patrol. Myself and Private First Class Elaine Torres, 20 years old, had been on post for 4 months and had not yet worked the old administrative sector. At 0311, we were on the 3rd floor of Building 608. Torres stopped walking. I almost walked into her. She was looking toward the east stairwell door. "Sergeant Cole," she said, "there's someone standing at the end of the hall." I looked. The figure was there. The same place, the same posture. Tall, narrow-shouldered, completely still. We watched it for 45 seconds. I counted, because I knew that the next thing that would happen was what always happened, and I wanted to know exactly how long it lasted. 45 seconds. Then it was gone. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What was that?" "Environmental anomaly," I said. And I hated myself for saying it. She filed an incident report. I reviewed it before submission. Her description matched mine from 2 years earlier, word for word, in ways that went beyond coincidence. Neither of us had discussed what we expected to see before we saw it. Same figure, same door, same stillness. I went to my company commander the following Monday. I brought my notebook. I brought the list of cross-referenced incident reports. I sat down across from Captain Elliot Morrison and I laid it out for him. The pattern, the dates, the buildings, the number. He listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Cole, what exactly do you want me to do with this?" I said I wanted it formally investigated. I said the pattern represented a level of consistency that warranted examination beyond the individual no evidence found classification. He looked at my notebook. He looked at me. "I'm going to ask you a question," he said, "and I want you to think about the answer before you give it. Do you believe this building is haunted?" I said I believed the documented pattern was real and unexplained. "That's not what I asked," he said. He closed my notebook and handed it back to me. He told me that Fort Riley's historic buildings had been the subject of informal documentation by soldiers going back as far as anyone can remember, and that the Army's official position was that old buildings with old construction generated old noises. He told me to enjoy the rest of my assignment. He thanked me for my service. I walked out of that office carrying my notebook, and I understood in that moment exactly where those 14 individual reports had gone. Not into a filing system that no one checked, into the same place everything inconvenient goes in a large bureaucracy. Nowhere. I left Fort Riley in May of 2012. I served out the remainder of my enlistment at a post in Georgia and was honorably discharged in 2015. I've been thinking about Building 608 ever since. The pattern I documented is not unique to Fort Riley. In the years since my discharge, I have spoken to veterans from other installations, Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, Fort Monroe in Virginia before its closure, the Presidio in California, who describe similar experiences in older buildings, similar patterns, similar command responses, similar notebooks that went nowhere. What I want to say about Fort Riley is this: the post has a recorded history that goes back 173 years. In that time, it has housed soldiers during the Civil War, the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The ground beneath it has absorbed generations of American military experience in ways that the official record can only partially describe. The building I patrolled is still standing. The third floor is still accessible. Soldiers are still stationed there. I don't know if what I saw was the spirit of a soldier who died in that building 100 years ago. I am not in a position to make that claim, and I would not make it. What I can tell you, with the same confidence I would bring to any official report I ever filed, is this: the figure at the east stairwell door was real. Torres saw it. I saw it. 14 others across 18 years filed reports describing the same thing in the same location. What the Army calls environmental anomaly has a face, it has a place, and it appears to have a schedule. I kept my notebook. I still have it. I have added to it over the years as I have spoken to more veterans from more installations. The number has grown. The pattern has held. I think about what it means that 1,500 soldiers encountered something in those buildings, and none of them, not one, ever saw those encounters treated as more than clerical noise. Each one was categorized, filed, and buried in a system designed to produce exactly that result. And I think about the private who served her 4 months at Fort Riley and came home with a story she couldn't explain and nobody to tell it to. The sergeant who requested reassignment and was recorded as personal reasons. The specialist who heard the roll call in the empty room and told no one because she had seen what happened to people who did. Those are real people. Their experiences were real. The question of what caused them, that I cannot answer. But I have stopped pretending that the question doesn't matter. Fort Riley is a live installation. Thousands of active duty soldiers and their families live there right now. The buildings are still being used. The night shifts are still being walked. And at 0300, on the third floor of Building 608, something still walks that corridor. I have been talking to veterans for more than a decade now. Not about military strategy, not about combat, about the other things. The things they saw in old buildings on quiet nights that never made it into any official account. The things that got categorized away and forgotten. There are more stories like this one. Many more. Some of them come from installations you would recognize. Some of them involve experiences that go far beyond what I've described today. This channel exists because those stories deserve to be heard. Not as entertainment, not as ghost tours. As testimony from credible witnesses who encountered something they couldn't explain. And were told, officially, systematically, that they had encountered nothing. If you believe these accounts deserve more than a filing cabinet, subscribe. New stories every week. What I've described today is one building, one post, one pattern. The archive goes much deeper. Tell me in the comments, have you or anyone you know been stationed somewhere with a history like this? A building, a location, a pattern that soldiers talked about in private but never in official reports? I want to hear your experience.